So our discussion of DNA and protein hopefully gives you a good idea of how the genetic information of an organism is stored as well as is translated into protein molecules that actually carry out the different functions in the cell that give that organism its unique properties. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the idea of genetic engineering, which is to go in and tinker with the sequence of the DNA, thereby changing the instruction and later on the molecules that are being made in the cell. So the proteins would also get changed. Of course, we have sort of the natural version of this. That's the mutation that I discussed in a prior video, for example, with the case of hemoglobin. That's an example of what we call a deleterious mutation, which is a mutation that is not beneficial for the organism, but there are also mutations that would be helpful for the organism. And naturally, these are selected through evolution to survive, right? The organisms with those mutations would then survive. Now, humans themselves have done this type of selection with different types of plants. Here is an example. You might have eaten these Granny Smith apples, which are these green apples that have a little tart taste and it's pretty crisp. So these were actually originally grown by accident in the backyard of Mrs. Maria Ann Smith in Australia, and she tasted the various apples that grew and figured out that she liked the one that has this crispness to it. And as it happens, these same apples also stored really well, so it could be used much later. What she did was she selected the seeds from those apples to plant some more of it. Now, if you think about that, that is artificial selection because somebody goes in and interfere with the growth of the other apples, preferring this one version of apples versus all the other ones. Now, over time, as this becomes a popular variety of apples, other growers also take it and crossbreed it with other apples to keep its ability to store, but then change the flavor of it to make it a little sweeter. So there are other varieties. You might have heard of the Braeburn apples that comes from the Granny Smith apples originally. Crossbreeding, like the one that is illustrated in this apple example, is a process of genetic engineering. What the farmers or growers are doing is to take a sequence of DNA from this plant, something they like, and then they select that and keep growing that until it takes over from all the other apple species or any other plant species, right? The only difference is that they didn't know they were doing that, right? They didn't understand DNA or know what they're actually doing, but that's exactly what's going on. The apples have specific gene sequences that give those properties that the farmers were looking for. Now, with the knowledge of the structure and function of both DNA and proteins, the modern day chemists and biologists have actually a very precise tool of changing the sequence of the DNA and thereby later on changing the sequence of the protein, providing some desirable properties for the plant. So the most common technique that this works is you cut out some part of a DNA or a gene that you like and you insert it in a carrier. Usually we call this a plasmid, and then we incorporate that plasmid into the cell of the organism that we're interested in. So for example, if we want to do this for corn, we would incorporate a particular gene into that corn genome, which is just the whole collection of genes that the corn plant has. Once that happens, the corn, as it duplicates and grows, it will incorporate that new gene and it will have that property. So essentially, you're doing what Granny Smith was doing, but with a much more precise tool. Now, these type of food is what we call genetically modified food or GM food. The organisms themselves are called genetically modified organism or GMOs. There's a lot of concern about this, generally speaking, because people don't quite understand what's going on. And when there is a discussion of something like a technique that I just described, where you have a gene from another organism being placed into the corn, we call this a transgenic organism, right? Because it's a gene from another organism that's being placed into something else. And there's concern that that new gene might change the behavior of the corn and what happens if I eat that corn and so on. a lot of times this is not really based on science, but it's more like fear of the unknown. And so one of the things you should do as informed consumers of this type of information is to really look into the science, try to understand it, and then decide for yourself whether this is indeed something that is dangerous or something that needs more studies. But it should not be something you would just walk away from without really understanding what's going on. There are many advantages of these genetically modified crops, one of which is this yellow rice or golden rice that has this color because it's been designed to contain a significant amount of vitamin A or beta carotene. And the reason that's needed is in some parts of the world, the population lacks significant amounts of vitamin A, and vitamin A is needed for the health of your eyes. So many of these children who lack vitamin A are blind or can't see, and an easy way to incorporate that vitamin A is through the genetic engineering of the rice that the population eats. And in fact, this turns out to be a really good intervention because just eating half a cup of the rice, the children could get the recommended daily allowance of vitamin A, and thereby resolving the issue of blindness that was caused by the lack of vitamin A in their diet. So I just want to close this chapter by mentioning how you should look back at the experimental data, understand it more carefully before deciding whether it is a good or a bad thing.